Okay, I am not sure what is going on and why I am oh, my video was turned off. That is not helpful. Okay, my video is on now. Hello, everyone. Um, I am here and it is time for the SSPX for the final SSPX report, because the SSPX is going to be officially in schism. Okay, I am not sure what is going on. Okay, and why I am. Okay, I'm gonna. Oh, my video was turned off. That is not helpful. Okay. All right. So now so anyway, the SSPX is going to go into schism on July 1st. So in case you're new to this situation or you're new to the channel, I will just very briefly summarize what is going on. So basically, okay. So I'm going to actually begin at the beginning, and then I am going to give a quick survey of, well, it'll probably take a couple hours because there's a lot of video. But I want to just give a quick survey of what the various traditional Catholics are saying right now about the SSPX consecrations and the current state of the Catholic Church. So without further ado, I will get started. Okay, so just to bring everybody up to date, the SSPX is the acronym that we use to refer to the Priestly Society of St. Pius X, which was founded in November of 1970. So the year after the changes to the Mass that were created by Vatican II, and after Vatican II was officially ratified, when all that came in. Marcel Lefebvre got permission to found it as a provisional organization and to found a seminary. Then in May of 1975, the SSPX was suppressed. The Lefebvre's response to that was this was Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. who participated in Vatican II, signed the documents, and then decided that he didn't like it very much. So he ordained priests without papal permission. In 1987, he said that the Pope was an apostate. Then, towards the end of his life, he sat down in 1988 with then Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict the 16th, who is the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And Benedict offered him one bishop in exchange for sitting down and discussing the doctrinal issues that affected that Lefebvre objected to. Well, as we're listening to the trad response, you'll find out what those issues are pretty quickly. The important part here is that Lefebvre was offered a deal. You'll have to excuse me. I'm also grinding laundry soap while I'm talking. Lefebvre was supposed to be had agreed one bishop, we sit down and talk. The deal was ready to be signed by him and the Pope in the morning. This was John Paul II at the time. Lefebvre thought about it, talked to some of his friends, ripped up the deal. He then consecrated 4 bishops, one of whom, Bishop Williamson, ended up being kicked out of the SSPX when it turned out that he was a Holocaust denier and really virulent anti-Semite. So he ordains these bishops, everybody's excommunicated. Then Benedict the 16th becomes Pope, and the SSPX is gradually starting to be brought back into the fold. Then this takes us to 2026, when the SSPX announces that they are going to consecrate 4 bishops. Or rather, they announce that they're going to consecrate an unknown number of bishops. And they were told in no uncertain terms by the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith that that was not going to be acceptable unless they were willing to sit down and actually talk about what the issues were. And they didn't do that. Now, there's not going to be a whole lot to say about the SSPX for a little while after the consecrations, because at this point we're going to be basically looking and waiting to see what the fallout is, because there are traditional Catholics who are supporting the SSPX, but who don't think that there should be but who think that who are not going to follow them into schism. There are other people who are not currently attending SSPX chapels who are strongly considering following the SSPX into schism, or at least encouraging people to not. By the way, schism is probably a term that I should define. That is essentially when a group of people declare themselves to be separate themselves from the Catholic Church. So if you're within the Catholic Church and you leave, you are now a schismatic. So, for example, Martin Luther is probably the best example of a schismatic. And the SSPX are really sort of founding their own little Protestant church. Oh, by the way, the fit for this video is my German soccer unicorn. Sadly, the German soccer unicorn did not get them a victory against Ecuador, but, you know, apparently Our Lady of Guadalupe is pulling some strings up in heaven. That's all I got to say. Okay, so once again, I have no interest in sort of steel manning these positions of some of the trads, I think the easiest way to do that is to just let them speak in their own words, and then I will provide the necessary footnotes to put what they're saying in context and to let you see exactly how out of sync and out of touch they are with the mainstream of the Catholic Church. Because I think that it's very easy to, especially if you're on the internet, to get the idea that these really extreme traditional Catholics are the future and that they're what the church is. And statistically, that's just not true. Next week, I'm going to be going over a very interesting document on Thursday that came out of the Archdiocese of Chicago that is basically saying who is converting to Catholicism and why, which is very interesting because about 75% of the people, according to this document, are, oh, no, sorry, about 80% of the people, according to this document, are really not looking for traditional Catholicism. They want the Catholic Church as it exists today, especially with Leo doing a lot of things that open up the church to Catholics who are divorced and remarried, Catholics who are gay, Catholics or Catholics who are transgender, Catholics of all sexual orientations who are either living as single people or are in a committed relationship with a member of the same sex. All of those things are being made a lot easier to live your life as a Catholic. And they're moving away from the exclusive focus on making abortion illegal, which is a really important change. So, and also really entering into honest ecumenical dialogue. That is the church that the majority of Catholics want. And I'm not saying this in a polemical way. I'm just saying what the statistics show. This is numbers. So keep in mind as I'm showing you what these guys are saying that this is not the majority of the Catholic Church. It's just an entertaining part of the Catholic Church because they get really ridiculous. Okay, now before we get to this, and to put things in perspective, I want to play you this very short 1-minute clip from the SSPX sorry, not the SSPX, from Rome Reports in English. And this is commenting specifically on a document that was issued by the Vatican in response to the request by some of the German bishops to allow lay people to preach the homily.
The Vatican has said no to one of the requests put forward by the German bishops, allowing lay people, on an exceptional basis, to preach the homily during Mass, a role reserved under canon law exclusively to priests. The request was submitted on March 30th and reflects the progressive approach of Germany's synodal path, but the Dicastery for Divine Worship has rejected it. While expressing its appreciation for the pastoral concerns that inspired the request, the Dicastery reaffirms that the current discipline cannot be dispensed by means of an indult, since the reservation of the homily to a priest or a deacon is...
An indult is when the local bishop gives a particular church or particular diocese permission to bend the rules a little bit. One example of this is in Las Vegas, the Shrine of the Most Holy Redeemer and Guardian Angel Cathedral both have permission to have a mass in the early afternoon on Saturday, because typically if you go to the Saturday vigil mass, it will be like in the late afternoon or evening, like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in there, so that it's definitely like almost sunset. That counts. Just going to an early mass on Saturday doesn't count for your Sunday obligation. So Guardian Angel Cathedral has an indult that allows them to have a mass at 2:30 in the afternoon that counts for the Sunday obligation, because there are a lot of Catholics who work at casinos in Las Vegas, and they work nights. So you can go to mass before you start your shift, you're good to go. That's an indult. So what they're saying is, no, you can't just grant an indult and say, okay, yeah, lay people can give the homily.
Is not merely a disciplinary norm, but derives from the very nature of the liturgy. The department also reminds the bishops that the church provides other ways for lay people to participate, outside the homily and apart from the Eucharistic celebration.
Now, the reason why I showed you this video is because I want to make it absolutely clear that when these so-called when these traditional Catholics, the people who wanted the clock to stop in 1916, 15 something, they all have different dates. There's not a lot of consistency at which point the Catholic Church was most traditional and most perfect. But they will complain, oh, the liberals never get told no. Well, that's just factually incorrect. The liberals get told no all the time. They just got told no. So now that we've gotten that point out of the way, I would like to play you this. We're going to play this short video from Bishop Strickland.
Hey, my friends, as we approach.
And just to remind you, this is John Henry Weston. Sign of the Cross Media is another outlet that's run by LifeSite News, which is an extremist anti-abortion organization that is based in Canada.
Approach the date of the July 1st consecration of new bishops for the SSPX, the Society of Pope Pius X, there's greater and greater controversy. The Vatican just met with the leaders of the SSPX Cardinal Fernandez met with them. And of course, they've been presented with some kind of ultimatum not to do it, but there's no indication yet of what exactly is going to happen. Bishops have come out on both sides of the question. And one of the bishops who has.
Okay. What he just said is factually incorrect. And let's see. Okay. This was 4 months ago, but they had already been told that they would incur excommunication because that's just, according to canon law, when a bishop is consecrated without papal permission, both the person being consecrated and all of the participants are excommunicated. That's clear. They're saying that there isn't clarity because they don't want there to be clarity. They want there to be doubt and confusion and question.
Has come out, it is Bishop Joseph Strickland. And I wanted to give you his rationale for supporting the move of the SSPX to do the consecration of bishops, even without the Pope's approval. And very controversial. You can go read his full statement over at LifeSite News or at his own website, Pillars of Faith. But I wanted to give you just a snippet here so you can understand where he's coming from. He said, and I quote, "The church is in an emergency. The emergency is that there is," and I quote, "silence where there must be answers." He goes on to say, and I quote again, "When men who openly contradict Catholic teaching are tolerated, promoted, and even celebrated, while those who hold fast to tradition are restricted, sidelined, or ignored, something is upside down." Now, of course, he acknowledges that the SSP.
Now, remember, this is the bishop from Strickland, is the bishop from Texas, who was given the opportunity to resign and go into retirement due to his mismanagement of his diocese in Texas. So when he's talking about people being promoted, he's talking about people being promoted that he doesn't like. And when he's talking about people being punished for being too traditional, he's claiming that that includes him when he was removed. And he was also removed after he had publicly called the Pope a heretic. He had publicly said things about the Pope that would get anyone fired from their job if they said that about their boss. And that's just the facts.
SSPX made their plea to the Pope. He says they did so soberly and respectfully, and when that plea is met with silence, delay becomes a decision, he says. It's not about clinging to the past, it's about survival, he says. It's not an institution of the priesthood and the sacraments and the Catholic faith as it has been received, handed down, and guarded for centuries. He goes on, he says, when confusion is indulged and fidelity.
And again, this is a Protestant argument. They are literally reading the past documents of the church in the same literalist way that Protestants read the Bible and say, oh, well, I found in my interpretation of this document, it says X. So therefore, X is correct, without respecting the fact that traditionally in the Catholic Church, the right to declare a dogma, the right to say, okay, this is what this thing means, belongs to the Pope and to his advisors. You may disagree with it. Catholics are allowed to disagree with it. But you're not supposed to put your own interpretation of documents above the Pope's. Unless, and again, do people disagree? Yes. For example, a lot of Catholics use birth control because their understanding of the documents around birth control make them think this is not a good thing. This is not realistic. But for most Catholics, that is the point that that is their single point of disagreement. These guys want to throw out everything that has happened in the last 60 years and go back to their fantasy of a church. Because again, this happened in the 1960s. Our current Pope was born in 1955. He was a child. There are almost no living people who have adult memories of the church before Vatican II. They're advocating for a dream and a fantasy.
Authority must beg to survive. Authority has stopped doing what authority exists to do. There are priests and bishops who publicly undermine Catholic teaching on marriage, on sexuality, on the uniqueness of Christ, on the necessity of repentance, and nothing happens. They are praised for their accompaniment, and we are told that this is mercy. But when priests want to offer the Mass as it was offered for centuries, when they want to be
Again, that statement is factually incorrect. There is no problem with offering the Mass in the Latin language or with incorporating Latin into an ordinary service. My church, for example, often does the Sanctus prayer and the Agnus Dei prayer in Latin. That isn't the problem. And there are lots, and there are several Catholic priesthoods that are Catholic priestly fraternities, including the Society of St. Peter, the FSSP, which is different. And then there's the Institute of Christ the King. Both do exclusively the Latin Mass. There are other organizations that do. So the whole idea that, oh, the SSPX are just those, they're just the people who love the Latin Mass, that is a smokescreen for their real issues. And John Henry Weston is giving them cover, and so is Bishop Strickland.
Formed according to the mind of the church that produced saints. When they want bishops, so the priesthood itself does not die out. They are treated as a problem to be managed. That is not mercy. That is inversion. Very strong words from Bishop Strickland. And he acknowledges that they're strong words. Here's what he says in his own words. And I know some people will recoil when they hear that. They will say that this language is too strong. They will say it unsettles people. End quote. What's his answer? He says, good. Because a church that is never unsettled by truth is already asleep. Our Lord unsettled people constantly. He overturned tables. He named hypocrisy. He warned shepherds who fed themselves instead of the flock. He did not speak gently to those who distorted the truth while claiming authority. He adds, and I'm not interested in a peace that is.
And again, I just have to admire their supreme and unshakable confidence that they are right. And their complete unwillingness to understand that they could be wrong. And that what they're doing is causing the problem.
Purchased by silence. I'm not interested in unity that requires lying to ourselves. I'm not interested in stability that comes at the price of surrender. He closes off a rather lengthy statement saying the salvation of souls must remain the supreme law of the church. That's his defense. Tell us below in the remarks what you think about it. Please like and share this video so that we...
No, thanks. Now, this next...
The Society of St. Pius.
Okay, this next video, and again, this is coming from someone who is already a sedevacantist. But he has interesting information. So let's see what he has to say about the guys who are being consecrated as SSPX bishops. because it's really interesting who they actually picked.
Pius X officially announced the names of the 4 priests who will become bishops at the July 1st consecrations. So who are they, and why did the SSPX leadership choose these men to lead the society into the future? Hi, and welcome back to Ad Vaticanum. I'm Robert, also known as Purely Catholic on YouTube. And today we're breaking down a massive development in the traditional Catholic world. The Society of St. Pius X has officially released the names of the 4 priests they will consecrate as bishops next month. So let's take a close look at who these 4 men are, unpack their backgrounds, and analyze exactly why the society chose them for these high-stakes positions amid intense scrutiny from Rome. So first up is Father Marc Napier. Born in 1990 into a large French Catholic family of 10 children, Father Marc Napier's upbringing was richly blessed with religious vocations. Among his siblings are a priest of the society, a Capuchin friar of Morgon, and a Dominican teaching sister. After studying at
specifically, all of his siblings who are in religious life are in religious order, are either in the SSPX, that's the brother who's a priest, and then the sister who is a nun and the brother who is a monk. They are both members of orders that are associated with the SSPX. This is someone who was raised in the SSPX. He doesn't know anything else. For him, the SSPX is the Catholic Church.
He was ordained in 2013 and dedicated his early priesthood to education. In 2020, he was appointed professor at the seminary in Dillwyn, Virginia. To prepare for the assignment, he spent a year in Scotland sharpening his English while assisting in local parish work. Now a professor of metaphysics and dogmatic theology, Father Napier balances his academic duties with Sunday pastoral work across several chapels. What stands out to me about Father Napier is how incredibly young he is. If he was born in 1990, this means he is only 36 years old. The Roman Catholic Church hasn't appointed a bishop this young since the mid-20th century. You have to look back to prelates like Cardinal Lorenze, Cardinal Sarah, and Archbishop Sheen. The society appears to be shooting for longevity. While they likely have some very holy priests who are in their 60s or 70s, they're likely...
Yeah, so this guy is 36 years old. That is shockingly young. In the Catholic Church, typically somebody who is in their mid-30s, even if there's someone who is, a brilliant communicator, a brilliant pastor, a brilliant theologian, mid-30s would be when you get appointed like an auxiliary bishop. That means that you're an assistant bishop who's helping out a bishop in a large diocese. Typically, you would be an auxiliary bishop for some time, and a lot of people, that's their whole career. Or if they do get promoted upwards, that will be after they've been an auxiliary bishop for quite some time. The fact that this guy is going straight from teaching at a seminary to being just a full-on bishop is really shocking. Also, the fact that he only has 2 languages, again, typically in the United States, if a man is not fluent in Spanish, frankly, he's underqualified. In my own diocese, Auxiliary Bishop Pham, who's in his mid-40s, he was a Vietnamese refugee, born to a Vietnamese refugee family that came to the United States. He speaks Spanish, English, Vietnamese, and French. You have in the US, they have Spanish. That's just how it works. And the fact that they are cutting themselves off from the Latino community is both interesting and frankly kind of worrying.
Not looking to push for further consecrations for a while. Father Napier is young enough to still be in leadership in 40 years after 2, maybe even 3 pontificates have passed. Next up, we have Father Michel Ponsinet de Sivry. Father de Sivry is just 42 years old and was raised in a French Catholic family of 7 children. After receiving his priestly formation, he was ordained in 2008. He dedicated the early years of his priesthood to education and pastoral care, beginning in southern France. In 2011, he took over the leadership of St. Louis Primary School in Paris, balancing his responsibility with his pastoral duties. He later spent 6 years directing the Saint Jean-Baptiste de la Salle Secondary School. Since 2022, Father de Sivry has served as the superior of the Benelux district and oversees the society's operations in the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So here we have another young French Catholic with a background in education. While the SSPX is a global organization, France is largely considered the beating heart of the society. The founder, Archbishop Lefebvre, was French.
That is actually factually true. The SSPX is basically an organization that exists in France. And of course, they have some presence in the Francophone areas in Switzerland, which is where Marcel Lefebvre is buried in the city of Icon, which is where the consecrations are going to take place. There's also about half of the SSPX, it's like roughly half are in France, roughly half are in America, and then there's like another small percentage that's sort of scattered all over the world.
French, and one could only assume that we would see more bishops from this region. However, some Catholics online have pointed out that there is no representation from Latin America, and that could hinder the society in the future. Bishop Alfonso de Galarreta, who was part of the original consecrations under Archbishop Lefebvre, was born in Spain and spent significant time in Argentina, which was a strategic move for the society as a whole. So before we take a look at the next 2 future SSPX bishops, I want to talk about Ad Vaticanum. This is a new Catholic news site that can keep you totally up to date with what's happening.
Okay. I'm skipping the ad.
Father Golday began his ministry in Armada, Michigan, serving there for 5 years before being appointed director of the retreat house in Richfield. In 2014, he became prior in Kansas City, where he managed a complex apostolate comprising the priory, a large parish, a school, and a community of religious sisters. His responsibilities expanded further in 2021 when he was named assistant to the district superior. 2 years later, he was appointed the rector of St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary in Virginia, and now oversees the formation of nearly 100 seminarians. So we all knew that the society would choose at least one bishop from the USA. While France is still sort of considered the main hub, the United States has been catching up quickly. Another interesting fact to point out is that these are all company men. All 4 have spent their entire priestly ministries with the Society of St. Pius X. I think loyalty has to be a huge consideration when making this decision.
Yeah, I mean, he's right. There's no other way to read that. They're looking for people who are loyal to the SSPX. Again, that guy, that bishop, he does have enough experience that he's older, so he might be someone who would be considered for promotion to auxiliary bishop, except he only has English. Part of the reason why he stayed in the US for his whole career is that he was unable to acquire a sufficient fluency in French. Now, as someone who also struggles to learn languages, my heart goes out to him. But the fact of the matter is that not everyone is suited to be a bishop. But they clearly are not so much interested in producing bishops that are going to be good pastors. They're looking for bishops who are willing to pump out SSPX priests and who are company men, like he said, company men maintaining the rigid idea of orthodoxy that the SSPX has and has always pushed.
Bishop Richard Williamson, who was one of the 4 original bishops consecrated under Marcel Lefebvre, famously left the society to set up his own SSPX resistance organization. It's safe to say that the society must be highly motivated to avoid another situation like that. Okay, and finally, we have Father Pascal Schreiber. Father Schreiber is...
Yeah, the SSPX resistance was founded after Williamson was asked to leave the SSPX, when it turned out again that he was a Holocaust denier and virulent anti-Semite to a degree that was deeply embarrassing to the Vatican when it came out after he was given his after Pope Benedict allowed them remove their excommunications. Again, an excommunication is when you are still Catholic, but you no longer have access to the sacraments. Your behavior has put you in a place where either you need to change or you just wait for the church to change. And that was the choice and Williamson left. He left the SSPX. Now he has the SSPX resistance, which I will probably discuss at some point when I start on a survey of who is the weird nooks and crannies of the Catholic Church.
Is a 53-year-old Swiss national who was raised in a Catholic family of 5 children. He entered seminary in Salzgitter, Germany in 1992 before continuing his theological studies in Aachen, Switzerland, where he was ordained to the...
Again, that's after the 1988 excommunications. So these were all guys who were raised in the SSPX or entered the SSPX, in his case, entered the SSPX as a very young man after having been raised in a very conservative Catholic family.
The priesthood in the summer of 1998. Following 5 years of pastoral ministry across Germany and Switzerland, Father Schreiber was appointed director of a boys' secondary school in 2003. 2 years later, he transitioned to lead the girls' primary and secondary school, a role he held for 9 years. In 2014, he was assigned to the Swiss district headquarters in Rickenbach, serving for 2 years before being named district superior. Since August of 2020, Father Schreiber has served as rector of the Herz Jesus Seminary in Salzgitter, directing the formation of over 50 seminarians and brothers representing 16 countries. So at 53 years of age, Schreiber is the senior candidate among the 4 priests. I think this move is strategic due to Schreiber's strong administrative background.
Again, now like 50 to 60, it like typically bishops will be when someone finally becomes a bishop, it can happen theoretically at any age, but typically like early, like mid 50s to early 60s is kind of the sweet spot for bishops, right? Because bishops are required to submit their resignation when somebody's watching. Hi, person. Hi. If anybody, as I'm going through these guys, not so much the bishops, but the rest of them, if you want to speculate on whether or not they're going to follow the SSPX into schism, that would be fun. But I digress. The point is that this guy, again, he's the kind of person that normally might get a promotion to be an auxiliary. If he's doing a really good job, that's the kind of resume that gets you a position as an auxiliary bishop. And then maybe, in the, late, in like the late 50s, early 60s, because again, bishops submit their letter of resignation at 75. They're required to retire at age 80. So you get a guy who's like in his late 50s, early 60s, you're going to get somebody who's in there for 12 to 15 years. Maybe a little bit, maybe 20 at the outside. and then you get a new guy in, and that's generally considered to be a good number. So, essentially we get like somebody who's old enough to have some experience, but young enough to, do some useful work before they drop dead. Because, it's being a bishop in a lot of ways is you get an old man and you work him to death. And that's how it is. So yeah. Again, underqualified or barely qualified.
As the district superior of the Swiss district, he probably has strong experience running financial, legal, and personnel complexities. Also, while he's still relatively young, he was ordained in the 1990s, and this does demonstrate some degree of institutional stability and predictability for the society's members. So there you have it, the 4 priests that are set to take over the SSPX as their existing bishops continue to age into their 70s. This is going to be a rocky moment for the society if excommunications come down.
Yeah. So, and again, it's not if excommunications come down, it's when, because the Pope and the head of the DDF have both made it extremely clear that, they've just reminded them there's a sentence of excommunication, consecrating bishops without a papal mandate earns you an automatic excommunication, and that's just how it works. Now, I want to take a minute to listen to a little bit of what the SSPX is saying to their own members. This is a live stream that was made by an SSPX priest who is serving in Singapore. And we'll hear what he has to say, because his explanation that he's given to his congregation, and again, if you are when we're listening to him talking, please remember that a lot of people who are going to these SSPX chapels are in an echo chamber. They're getting their information from their priests and from SSPX friendly online sources. So what he's saying is what a lot of them probably genuinely believe. So let's see what he has to say.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. So, my dear faithful, as I just mentioned, tonight our group will leave towards Switzerland in order to make our way to the bishop consecrations on July the 1st. And before leaving, I would like to summarize with a few words, briefly, what is the spirit we must keep in these circumstances? Because we don't know, we really don't know what will happen in 10 days. Yes, we know that we will consecrate bishops, there is no doubt about it, but we still have no idea exactly of what will happen regarding Rome. Will the
That is factually incorrect. The SSPX has been told what will happen. They know. They know what they're doing, and they're doing it.
communication come? Will the Pope tolerate the bishop consecration without condemning? Currently, I would say it doesn't look that way. It seems we are more heading towards a condemnation. So it's very important, during these weeks from now onwards, to really keep in our mind the spirit that guides us What is the spirit that guides us? Very important, a very important question. And you know, today is Father's Day, so I would really like to talk to you.
Yes, I too am, and this is why I'm showing this. I too am very curious to see what is on these guys' minds.
Like a father talks to his children to really teach them things which are extremely important, essential for our perseverance, and more than that, for our sanctification. Because, you know, God is allowing us to live throughout these circumstances for a reason, and we must live these weeks in a holy way.
Yeah, so
That sanctifies our souls.
I'm just going to leave it muted and I'll pause when I get to my next timestamp. But you can see how they're trying to spin this and how they're trying to be like, oh, we're being faithful. We are just listening. We are the innocent victims as the big bad Pope is being big and bad. And that's just a complete distortion of the facts. And there's really nothing else to say about it. They're being deliberately deceptive. And they're being deliberately deceptive to people who sincerely want to be faithful Catholics and are being guided in a direction that is going to cut them off from the main body of the Catholic Church. There are approximately 600,000 people globally who go to SSPX chapels. That is a decent sized denomination. It's much smaller than the Catholic Church. And but the thing is that they've painted themselves into a corner because they believe that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So in this moment, when they are facing excommunication by their own choice, right? This is an automatic sentence of excommunication. Basically, it's, you know what's going on, you're making a choice. Those are just natural automatic consequences. It's the same way if you go off, if you take off your coat and you walk into a blizzard in North Dakota, natural consequences. If you don't put on your sunblock and you go to the beach, you might get a sunburn. Natural consequences. They don't want to believe in these natural consequences. Okay, so let's see what else he has to say. Oops.
And repeat it to you. You must obey. You must obey the Pope. If you're Catholic, if you say you are following tradition, you must obey. That's the first thing we ask from a Catholic, to acknowledge the authority of the Pope and to obey. And what can we answer to that? Of course.
Okay. That's the thing, is that for a Catholic, accepting the authority of the Pope and obeying the Pope are generally considered like mandatory. Again, it's possible to say that the church should change. It's possible to, in your own life, disagree with the church on a few key points. But when you're saying, at this moment in time, I don't have to listen to the Pope about anything, which is what the SSPX is saying, you've stepped outside of the Catholic Church. That's just how it works. I mean, And to give you some idea of how seriously the Catholic Church takes that, one of the things that you have to do at your confirmation is accept the authority of the Pope. And for someone who was, say, baptized a Lutheran or baptized a Presbyterian, someone who the Catholic Church considers to already be Christian, before you can receive communion, you literally have to take an oath. You have to take the confirmation oath, which means that you are now accepting the authority of the Pope. That is a necessary precondition for being part of the Catholic Church. They're trying to weasel their way around this, and he's going to explain how they're doing that.
Must have this disposition of obedience towards the Holy Father, which we keep in our heart like a treasure, this disposition of love to the papacy, to the Pope. But that's not the question here. That's not the question. The question is the question of faith. Because unfortunately, and you know that, for the past 60 years, they have been asking us out of obedience to lose the Catholic faith. They're asking us to abandon the truth of faith, the tradition of the church, the way to heaven, the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ crucified, true God and true man, only way to salvation. This is the question. And faith is the base of obedience. The first obedience we owe to God is the obedience of faith.
Okay. Now, it was subtle. So I want to pause and point it out. He said, Jesus Christ crucified as the only path to salvation. What he is invoking there is the doctrine of extra ecclesiam non salus. That was a phrase that honestly, I, as a cradle Catholic, first encountered and had to Google a few months ago, because that's not a doctrine that has been taught in the mainstream Catholic Church in over 60 years. The idea that anyone who is not a Catholic is doomed to eternal conscious torment is something that the Catholic Church decided was nonsense and abandoned, because it was just deemed to be almost ridiculous on its face, right? Because, I mean, again, when an LDS person converts to the Catholic Church, one of the things that they very quickly find is one of the things that attracts them, and this is true of Lutherans, this is true of Episcopalians, this is true of a lot of people, they find that the things that they liked, right, were the things that they really love about the Catholic Church were the things that were good in their own religious experience, but they're finding things that were missing in their religious life within the Catholic Church, which is the way that the Catholic Church currently views things, is that it's better and it's easier to go to heaven if you're Catholic, but it's not the only way. So if all y'all want to play on hard mode, shine on you crazy diamonds. If you want to do it the easy way, come be Catholic. That is essentially the message that the Catholic Church has been sending out into the world for 60 years. These guys don't like it because many of them honestly say that if you can be saved without being Catholic, why should you be Catholic? Which to me implies a lack of faith and a lack of love for the Catholic Church. Because, again, if you are Catholic because you fear punishment, you're not in the church because you love the church. You're in the church because you're afraid of leaving. It's the same way that opponents of same-sex marriage will very often say, well, if it was legal to leave a man, if it was legal to be married to a man, why would anyone marry a woman? Well, you're kind of telling on yourself there, dude, right?
Believing in him, believing in our Lord Jesus Christ, who revealed to us the way to heaven. That's the first obedience. Now, if any authority, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, explains very well in Summa Theologica, if any authority asks a precept, commands a precept against faith or the theological virtues, we cannot obey. That's very simple, because the authority itself is disobeying God. So we cannot obey the authority because this way we disobey God. The authority itself is missing the point. And this is what's happening. Don't get fooled by this false argument of obedience, which has been working, unfortunately, for so many people, for the past 6 decades, since the Council Vatican II. Out of obedience, they imposed a Protestant religion.
Okay. Now, just real quick before he gets into his Protestant religion rant, again, this is an argument that says that the Catholic Church is not the Catholic Church. And it's an argument that puts Father Jean-Michel's interpretation of tradition above the head of above the interpretation of tradition coming from the College of Cardinals, coming from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, coming from the Pope. And let's be very clear here. In the Middle Ages, that kind of preaching would have severe consequences. Literally, they want to live in a world in which the Pope will play nice. Because if the Pope was not playing nice, which is what they say they want. They say they want a hard, rigid Pope who will invoke the monarchical papacy. And if that's the case, I mean, that's how you end up in house arrest. That's how you end up burnt back in the bad old days, which no one wants to go back to except these guys. Because they want a world in which they are the Catholic Church. And that world doesn't exist.
Synodality, modernism, ecumenism, apostasy of the faith, relativism, and now even, acknowledgement of homosexual couples, homosexuality. There is no sin anymore out of obedience. That comes from Rome, therefore it has to be accepted. No, absolutely.
I would just like to note for the record that literally everything that he just ticked off are the reasons why people have started to come back to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, like most churches, has lost a lot of people to disaffiliation. But the Catholic Church, for the first time in a long time, is actually, for example, in the United States, experiencing about 1% growth, which is small, but a steady 1% is not nothing, right? That means that your pews are full and you're getting a few extra people every year. And again, there's a lot of adult conversions. We don't have firm numbers quite yet because the so-called Francis effect and the Leo effect especially hasn't been going on long enough to be studied thoroughly. However, next week, again, I'm going to be going over a really interesting document from the Archdiocese of Chicago that talks about who's converting and why.
Not. If what comes goes against the Catholic faith. So the spirit of faith is essential. And all the people, who won't understand why we are proceeding with the bishop consecrations, because they miss that point. That's essential, fundamental point of the faith. They just look at the bit.
Yeah. So again, he's arguing against obedience. He's, shall we say, protesting against what the Catholic Church is doing. Okay.
And because the other Mass, the Novus Ordo, unfortunately, is like a Protestant celebration, very similar. They modified the Mass in such a way that it became acceptable by the Protestants. That's the point, not a preference, an opinion. It's a matter of faith. When we say that we cannot follow the Pope when he does a...
Okay, yes, it is true that part of the reason for the switch to the vernacular language was because having the entire religious service be in a language that no one in the congregation spoke was considered to be a barrier for conversion. But, it's worth noting that the Catholic Mass was not originally celebrated in Latin. The Latin Mass is cool, but and again, the use of the Latin language is not a problem.
There were a meeting like Assisi in 1986, meeting all the religions together to pray for the peace. It's not a matter of preference. It's because there is only one God, one Lord, one way to heaven, our Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus crucified. Nothing else, nobody else can guide the soul towards eternity, bring salvation to mankind. This is not a question of preference. This is the essence of our faith. So remember that. Every time, they come with this wrong argument, obedience. When they say obedience, you say faith. Obedience, faith. Faith first, God first. Because this is the reality. This is the problem. Now, the spirit of faith implies also, and I think this is important to highlight it, having faith in the church, in the papacy, despite what is going on. Because we could be tempted, as so many were tempted in the past, facing crisis in the church, to think that that's it.
Okay. Now, he is trying to make this as a super traditional argument that, no, the Mass changed, it became Protestant, it's no good. So I would like to quote from Canon 6 of the Council of Trent. If anyone saith that the canon of the Mass contains errors and is therefore to be abrogated, let him be anathema. If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of Masses are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let them be anathema. So again, if we want to play the game of cherry picking Bible verses, well, guess what? People opposed to the SSPX can play too, right? The council, because it's like, okay, the Council of Trent says that if you say that the Mass causes impiety, you're anathema. So which is it? And of course, his answer to that would be, well, that was talking about the Tridentine Mass. Yes, that's true. The Tridentine Mass was a reform of the rite of the Mass that existed. There were a whole bunch of local rites. Anything less than 200 years old was out the window with Trent. And again, it's also worth considering that a lot of these allegedly Protestant innovations were actually taken from some of the older and less common Catholic rites. The reform of the liturgy is an extremely interesting topic. It's one that I'm going to be covering in more depth as once I finish working my way through Archbishop Bugnini's book about how the reform of the liturgy went down by someone who was in the room when it happened. Yeah, so let's continue. Oop. No, I didn't go far enough. Okay, 1530.
And this preaching about the religious freedom and the right of man, etc., never mentioning the rights of God. This is generalized. But keep in your mind that the church will continue. This is not the end. It will take a few decades, it will take some time, but the church will overcome that. It's just another crisis, a big one, but another one. Don't lose.
So this is their argument. And honestly, it's always dangerous to predict the future, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that this is like flat earther levels of complete nonsense, right? This is just saying, nah. This is saying that this is a toddler saying that if I hold my breath until I turn blue, I'll get my way. Because his argument is that eventually the entire Catholic Church will go, oh, yes, we were completely wrong to abandon centuries of prejudice and, frankly, bad theology. So, yes, now we will embrace the manifest truth that we should hate everyone who's not Catholic and be violent and be trying to convert people by force if necessary. That's his argument. And frankly, it's an argument that has been thoroughly rejected by the Catholic Church. This is one of the reasons why I think eventually the SSPX is going to hold an alternate conclave.
Faith in the church, in the papacy, in the Pope. That's very important because this is part of our Catholic legacy. We cannot be a Catholic, a true Catholic, without acknowledging the authority of Rome. And the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is the vicar of Christ. This is essential. This is essential. And you can see how during different crises, people got scandalized by difficult situations and they lost their faith in the church. Let's not allow it to happen to our soul. We keep strong, we hold firm the faith in the church. Now, the third aspect of our faith of the Spirit.
So, again, you can hear him saying, they are literally going to ignore the fact that they're excommunicated. They're going to pretend like they're going to like wishful think. They're going to manifest into the world the reality that they are not really excommunicated. it's delusion at this point.
Of faith, which is also extremely important. It's faith in divine providence. Whatever happens, God is in charge. He's in command. I say, Father, how can we say that with this disaster which is happening in the church, in the world? Yes, true. This is not glorious, but God is in charge. He's allowing it for greater good. Of course, we don't see this greater good yet.
Yeah. So they're just gonna wait. So let's see. 22. Okay, there we go.
Because if you don't have charity, everything is wasted. That's the first part, of course, having charity in our heart. But then, charity towards the neighbor, very important in this context, because all of us, all of you are facing.
When he's talking about charity, he's not talking about like physical or monetary support. He's talking about an attitude of mercy and understanding and trying to work peacefully and get along with people.
Facing or will face, situations of people who don't understand what's going on, and will tell you right in the face, you're schismatic, you're disobedient. And what does happen in our heart at that moment? Maybe I feel a bit upset. And there are feelings in our heart that go against charity. So let's be very careful. Charity is what differentiates the true Christian from the appearance of Christian. Charity towards the neighbor, forgiving the ones who doesn't understand, patience in conversation. And if you see that after talking to someone or another person, the person doesn't understand, doesn't change, keep peace in your heart. Practice charity, pray for the person. Don't get upset, don't go to...
What he is literally proposing here is the kind of attitude that causes people to go out, get a negative reaction, and then interpret that negative reaction as evidence that they are right and their cause is righteous. And that's a very dangerous attitude to have, and that's a very dangerous attitude to hold. Because again, and I think we can also see this in the way that they picked very young men who have just really come up within the SSPX educational system and who basically lack pastoral experience. They know they are preparing themselves to be a insulated little bubble that nothing comes in, or a closed system where nothing comes in and nothing goes out. And frankly, that raises the possibility that the SSPX is going to get really weird and really culty really fast. So let's see.
Will tell me, Father, if we are persecuted, they tell us that we're excommunicated, schismatic, how can we be joyful? Of course, we will deplore the injustice. We have to deplore the injustice which would be committed against tradition and against the church in itself, because there is no greater humiliation for the church than the Pope excommunicating the Catholic life. Because this is what we are talking about. It's not us, SSPX, is excommunicating the tradition of the church. 2,000 years of tradition of the church. This is what they are planning to do. If they do it, let's hope not. So there is a great humiliation that we will lament and regret if that happened. Again, let's pray for it to not happen.
Again, the only way that that is not going to happen is if the SSPX decides to not consecrate their bishops. He's talking about an if, and he's framing it as an injustice that's being done to them because they're trying to make an argument that will cause the people who go to SSPX chapels to continue going to SSPX chapels. That's the goal.
There is no greater humiliation for the church that the Pope excommunicating the Catholic life. Because this is what we're talking about. It's not us, SSPX, it's excommunicating the tradition of the church. 2,000 years of tradition of the church. This is what they are planning to do. If they do it, let's hope not. So there is a great humiliation that we will lament and regret if that happened. Again, let's pray for it to not happen. But this, putting that aside, if we are judged by the Lord, He estimates us worthy to be persecuted for the justice. He told us, let's be joyful. Let's be joyful. Being able to suffer for the love of Jesus, for his kingdom, for his cross, for his love.
There's a very good columnist named Fred Clark, who blogs on the Patheos website. And he has introduced a really lovely phrase called martyrbation. And martyrbation is when someone gets a great deal of personal pleasure and satisfaction from imagining what it would be like to be persecuted. Because keep in mind, the Catholic Pope Leo is going to say, okay, yeah, you guys incurred automatic excommunication. You're excommunicated. And then pretty much until the SSPX shows signs of being willing to enter into dialogue and settle the problems. And let's be very clear, from the Pope's point of view, part of settling this is a non-negotiable them accepting the decisions of Vatican II with regard to the Mass, with regard to ecumenical dialogue, with regard to the changes in the way that the Catholic Church now teaches that salvation is possible even for people who aren't Catholic, even for people who aren't Christian. That's what this guy doesn't like. Now, I want to take a second now. If you were watching last week, you saw that Anthony Stein is he is more in what we call the recognize and resist side. So he goes to a traditional chapel, but he's not formally affiliated with the SSPX. So I want to give you now a smattering of responses. We saw Anthony Stein last week. Now we're going to get another smattering of responses from people who are also, now this first person, Kennedy Hall, actually is affiliated with the SSPX and is going to be following them into schism. So I'm going to start Kennedy Hall. Let's see. Okay, I just need to run it back a tiny bit. Let's see.
Kind of an amazing statement, because it's to live, can you live in communion outside the church? They do believe that. This is why you can say to Protestants and schismatics, we are already one. Let us realize our communion together, etc. And he says,
sorry.
If you want to talk about people who stood up for the Catholic faith, you got to talk about the Cristeros. It's the 100th anniversary of the Cristero conflict in Mexico. We're going to Mexico with Catholic Heritage Tours, and a priest of the Society of St. Pius X is our chaplain this December perfect way to get ready for Christmas during Advent. Click the link.
One thing that is really fascinating is for people who are violently opposed to what comes out of to a lot of the liberation theology, who are violently opposed in many cases to the presence of Latino Catholics. They fetishize the Cristeros. It's like, okay, well, these are the good ones, right?
Underneath. Hope to see you there. You know, among other things, he said the following. He said, do not do this. Let us try to live in communion within the church.
He is quoting Pope Leo right now.
Which is kind of an amazing statement, because that's to live. Can you live in communion outside the church? They do believe that. This is why you can say to Protestants and schismatics, you know, we are already one.
That's not what Leo said, and that's not what Leo meant. Leo was offering a plea. He was saying that all of the Christian churches should come back to the Catholic Church, that we were split from the Orthodox, we should come back, that the Lutherans split off, they should come back. It's a statement of idealism and of wanting to find common ground between Christian denominations. It's a crazy dream. It's a wild dream. But, you know, I kind of love that for Leo. Because if you could end any of these big schisms, that would be really cool, right? But they don't want that. They want a small, rigid Catholic Church.
Let's realize our communion together, etc. And he says, certainly division among Christians is always a painful point, but they refuse to accept, and here, listen carefully, and I can speak Italian, and I listen to the Italian, it's the same thing, it's not a mistranslation, so no pope-splaining allowed here. They refuse.
Pope-splaining, by the way, is when the Pope says something that it's really obvious what the Pope means, and then all of these traditional Catholic commentators will seek to explain how what the Pope said is not what the Pope actually meant, because what the Pope actually meant is he agrees with them 100%. They read Vatican documents the same way that Protestants read the Bible.
Used to accept certain fundamental elements of the church, comma. So there's point one. Point two, starting with several points from the Second Vatican Council. Words have meaning, my friend. Words mean things. One of the great errors of our time is nominalism. It's one of the hallmarks of modernism. If you're interested in understanding modernism, my book, What Happened to Catholicism, link for that is underneath. It's 300 pages on understanding modernism. Nominalism is, like the word would say, like the word would suggest, the word nom, or noun, or name. It's like nameism or nounism. The idea that things don't have essential natures to them, and we call them what they approximate. So, for example, we don't know what a dog is, but we use the word dog to describe that thing that appears to us to be a dog. Seems like quibbling. It's not, because the logical conclusion of that is transgenderism, for one. You know, you can call someone something that they're not because they're not really the thing that you think they are, because we don't really know their nature.
That's actually a really interesting comparison, because essentially that's what he is saying about trans people is exactly what he's saying about the Pope. What he's saying is that his narrow understanding of what it means to be a human in a male body and the conclusions that he has drawn from that are more important and more real than the experience of the people who know that they're trans. And when you have a situation where one group of people has a very firm opinion about who they are and what's going on, and other people disagree with them, you're not going to have, you can't build community on that kind of fundamental disagreement. So ultimately, you have to either set that aside and say, okay, we'll debate this, we'll talk about this, but we're going to focus on the things that bring us together, the things that allow us to be in community. Or you rupture and you separate the communities. The SSPX is choosing rupture. And yeah, Kennedy Hall is kind of going through a hard time in his private life, so I'm not going to yell at him anymore, even though he's a transphobe. And I really sincerely hope that none of his children are trans, because I would be worried about their safety in that house. Now we are going to turn to Taylor Marshall, who is another very popular Catholic podcaster. And I am going to run him back to 154, which was when he started saying something that I could actually respond to.
Attacking me, saying I've sold out. I'm not 100% with the SSPX. And many of you know me. When I travel in the Latin Mass, wherever I am near the airport, wherever is the SSPX, I go there on Sunday. I shake your hands, we talk after Mass, we sip on coffee. You know me, I know you. Now, I'm a member of a FSSP parish, Fraternity of St. Peter, which comes out of the SSPX in 1988. You can't go through all the history.
All the history is that a bunch of priests who are not willing to follow Marcel Lefebvre into schism were allowed to form their own separate Latin Mass fraternity that continues to offer the Latin Mass. They have chapels all over the place, and they offer the Latin Mass. So these are people who are extremely conservative, extremely traditional in terms of liturgy. But they have found a way to live, thrive, and survive within the Catholic Church. Now, Taylor Marshall is in a really interesting position, because he basically makes his living by producing content for extremely traditional Catholics, extremely socially conservative Catholics. So in order to do that, he has to, if he loses all of his SSPX friendly fans, he's going to have a smaller paycheck. And so part of this is him just spinning things to maintain his paycheck.
But I wanted to give a little analogy before we go through it, because I've noticed this.
Okay. He has this really tortured barbecue analogy that's going to come up later, but I'll just save it for when we don't have to listen to him lay out the whole thing.
Go to the SSPX, but I go to the FSSP. And I do have some hesitations about what's happening on July 1st. All right, I'm going to articulate it, and if it makes you mad, it makes you mad, but I'm just being honest with you. All right. My chief concern, and I've talked about this with Kennedy Hall and other SSPX friends, my chief concern is that the society announced that they were going to consecrate bishops within the first year of Pope Leo's pontificate. Even more so within 9 months of Pope Leo being Pope. Now, as I understand things, it takes about a year to get your personnel, to set up your prefects, to get everything as you want as a Pope. They don't come in.
Now, it should be noted that the SSPX asked for bishops after Benedict had lifted the excommunication, after Francis had said, okay, you can do confessions in marriage. So basically, once they thought they were back in, the first thing they did was start pushing for new bishops. And the first thing they did when they were told no was threaten schism.
And usually change everything right away. I just think it was premature. Also, I've stated many times in the channel, I think Pope Leo assigning this to Cardinal Fernandez, who has the history of the Heal Me With Your Mouth, the erotic theology books, the legacy with liberation theology, with his authorship or his involvement in controversial documents under Pope Francis, the publication of the document, state or questioning or disapproving of the title of co-redemptrix or mediators of all graces, which was Fernandez doing. All of these things are major mistakes, enforced errors, and fumbles on the.
Oh, I like, in a like completely chaste, completely appropriate, and like fangirl way, I'm like, Cardinal Fernandez, you're awesome. You're doing so many good things. I love you like a brother. I respect you as a priest. And he wrote good poetry. And Heal Me With Your Mouth, which is a document that I'm probably going to go over at some point. I know I keep saying, oh, I'm going to go over this at some point, but I really am. Because Heal Me With Your Mouth is a book about kissing. And he literally went around and just asked a whole bunch of people, what does kissing mean to you, right? Like, how does that affect the way, how does that kind of intimate, but not necessarily sexual physical contact, how does that affect you as a person? And as a result, I'm willing to say that Cardinal Fernandez has a relatively normal understanding of human sexuality in the 20th and 21st century. And I really think that part of the reason why some of the new stuff that's coming out of the Vatican is relatively sane is because of Cardinal Fernandez. Taylor Marshall hates all of that because he left the Anglicans because he thought they weren't rigid enough. And again, I would like to note, Taylor Marshall was an ordained priest. He was an ordained Episcopal priest. He was married at the time, yes. He had the option of joining the Anglican Ordinariate. He chose not to. Instead of being a priest, he's now a layman with a podcast. I'm a laywoman with a podcast. I don't have a PhD. He has a PhD in theology. So if I go and get a PhD in theology, I would be just as qualified as Taylor Marshall. Because that's the point. If you're a layperson, you just don't have authority. So let's continue.
Part of Pope Leo, and certainly on the part of Cardinal Fernandez. I'm just concerned that it's a lot early on. If anything, during the pontificate of Pope Francis, who was generally friendly to the SSPX, he gave them faculties for confession, he gave them faculties for matrimony, generally very open to them.
Just real quick, faculties means that they are allowed to hear confessions and they are allowed to perform marriages, and those confessions and those marriages are both licit and valid. That means that they're being done according to the rules. That's something that is going to go away relatively quickly. Taylor Marshall is taking a wait and see approach because he's not ready to jump ship and follow into schism yet. Again, please leave a note in the comments about whether or not you think Taylor Marshall is going to follow the SSPX into schism, because I think he might.
And yet it was a very controversial pontificate. There was a state of emergency during those Pope Francis years. I think the emergency was greater during the Pope Francis years than it is now.
Yeah, one of his big hobbies has been explaining to people that Pope Leo didn't actually say what Pope Leo said. Sometimes with limited success. Okay, so.
Before today's show, because I want to know where you guys stand on this. And I can't say I was that surprised. The options were: I'm totally opposed to SSPX. I'm cautiously and concerned for the SSPX. I'm generally in favor of the SSPX, and I'm in favor of the SSPX and bishops. Okay. And what's surprising is 61% of you chose the strongest answer.
Okay. I have often said that traditional Catholics make up about 3% of the world's Catholic population. It's just that every single one of those people in that 3% has a very active social media account, which, you know, I can't cast stones either because I spend a decent amount of time online myself. But the point is that if I were an uncharitable person, a cynical person, I might think that part of the reason why someone like Taylor Marshall, who makes his bread and butter, who feeds his family off of being a Catholic influencer, is doing a little bit of market research here and finding out if the SSPX are unpopular with his audience or popular with his audience, so that he can moderate his tone accordingly.
Right? You're fully on board with the SSPX and the bishops. With a smaller segment, 16% saying you're in favor, and then tied with 16%, another 16% saying I'm cautious and concerned for the SSPX. And then at the very bottom, I'm totally opposed, only 6% of you. And I think y'all should remember that other than someone like my friend Kennedy Hall, I've been out there as an advocate. I want to remind you, you know, I was picked up this morning, I was rereading my book, Infiltration. On pages 187, 188, 189, this is my defense and my account of what Archbishop Lefebvre was up against into the year 1988 and the aftermath. Okay, so I want you to know that Taylor Marshall is your friend. All right, I'm out here publishing best-selling books that have a defense of Lefebvre. And actually look at the canon law and look at the correspondence and look at the terms. I'm your friend. But I also want you to understand that when we're sitting around grilling ribeyes.
Okay, this was his vision of the discussion in the Catholic Church. He was wanting you to imagine it as a bunch of brothers sitting around drinking some beers while they talk about how their dad is an absolute maniac.
Put on some brewskis and you say, I'm going to disobey dad and I want you to support me against dad. I'm a little cautious, all right? That's the situation. Now, I was going to talk about canon law today in the SSPX, but when this new profession of faith came out, 28 pages, I said, you know what? This is more important. So I don't think I'll have time to.
Yeah, the SSPX issued a 28-page 100, I think it's like 148 or 150 point statement of everything that they believe. Martin Luther limited himself to 95 problems. Apparently the SSPX found more to complain about than Martin Luther did. At some point, I will be going over that document, but I'm probably going to hold off on that a little bit because there's a lot more weird stuff to talk about than just the SSPX. And I know I've been giving them a little bit more oxygen than they frankly deserve. But you know, this is the biggest news story in the this is the thing that is going to affect the Catholic Church in an unknown way, and I kind of wanted to document it thoroughly and see kind of what the state of play was, what everyone was saying, as soon as, you know, kind of as this story is developing. So, my son is coming home and my doorbell is activating. So let's see. Yeah, that was all that he had to say that was particularly interesting. Now, our next guest is Father Chad Rippinger, who is talking to, who is on Timothy Gordon's podcast. Timothy Gordon is another, you know, traditionally Catholic influencer. He has a little bit smaller reach than some of these other people. I mainly have this for Rippinger. Now, today we're only going to look at the first part, which is the part where we have Chad Rippinger talking about how he thinks that aliens are actually demons, space aliens. Like people get kidnapped and they say, oh, they took me up into the spaceship and gave me a really weird colonoscopy. But I'm going to save that part for an entirely separate episode, just on the I could do a whole series on just Rippinger and his weirdness. We've actually done, Aldo and I already did a response video to Rippinger. The alien thing is super interesting. We'll get into it at some point. But right now, today, I'm going to talk about just Rippinger and the SSPX, because he, like Taylor Marshall, like Anthony Stein, are people who are more in what's called the recognize and resist camp, which basically says that we're going to stay in the Catholic Church, but we're going to try to not go along with the stuff that we disagree with, which is very close to becoming a schismatic position. And I think that there's a real possibility that if there is a further effort to kind of police the right side, the rightward boundary of the Catholic Church, that some of these people, like Rippinger, might very well follow the SSPX into schism, but he's not there yet. So let's see what there is to say. Okay, so I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit.
I have a very complicated view of that whole discussion. It's complicated by it's complicated because the Vatican has been complicated, frankly. But my initial thoughts are,
and this is the interesting thing, is that all of these guys are wanting to scapegoat the Vatican, specifically Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, Tuco, the head of the Inquisition, always in my heart. And scapegoat Pope Leo. Now Timothy Gordon is traditional, and I want to give him a shout out and a lot of credit, because he really is trying to do good journalism and really is asking Father Rippinger some of, and it's actually interesting that he's always Father Rippinger instead of Father Chad, because it's a little bit harder to take Father Chad seriously. But Timothy Gordon is actually asking him some hard questions, and I want to salute him for that, because it's very easy to become polemical. I know that sometimes I cross that line too, and am and being Leo's chihuahua. And just yapping at people to maintain the boundaries. So I always appreciate it when people are willing to at least consider the other side and are willing to actually ask some hard questions.
I would like to see them not do it, and try and work something out, but that's kind of my initial thoughts. If you want to get into the nitty gritty of it, I'd be happy to.
As Jack Black says in Nacho Libre, the nitty gritty. Okay. So I have a more nuanced view than the average pro or con Catholic out there too. But here's my first detailed question. Nuance is better for
Timothy Gordon is now, again, if you're watching this, like, share, subscribe, all those things. Also, drop a comment about which of these two guys you think is going to go into schism. I think that in 5 years, Timothy Gordon will definitely still be a Roman Catholic. I'm less sure about Father Rippinger, but we'll see how it shakes out.
For cats like a Father Chad or a Tim Gordon. When dealing with an unknown quantity like obedience, an unknown soteriological quantity / quality like obedience, how are these guys? Let's assume that we're kind of, broadly speaking, rooting for the SSPX because they stand for something good without ending from the details. I mean, God.
Right.
So how are these guys, who are basically good guys, so confident? How are they not sleeping in thunder, given that we don't really know what are the real push points and pull points for making it into heaven when you've done an act that's disobedient, you're claiming an emergency condition? Like, how wouldn't you as a priest be worried about not meeting muster on obedience? I'm not the most obedient cat by nature.
And Timothy Gordon raises actually a really good point, that even if you are operating from an extremely traditional Catholic framework, an extremely theologically conservative Catholic framework, that going into schism and being excommunicated, now, the people who invoke what's called hopeful universalism, which is basically the idea that we are permitted to hope that hell is empty, right? We are allowed to believe that after sufficient time in purgatory, everyone can be saved. That everyone repents, that no one who does something that is truly heinous doesn't understand what they're wrong, that they were wrong and is on some level sorry and is on some level capable of expiating that sin. There may be exceptions to that. We don't know, but we're allowed to hope. These guys generally reject hopeful universalism. They believe that you're either in or you're out. So by traditional Catholic logic, by theologically conservative logic, lack of submission of intellect and will, especially if it's leading you into schism, is a mortal sin. So what they're dancing around here is the fact that according to the rules that the SSPX claims to believe in, they, by doing those consecrations, will be condemned to eternal conscious torment. Do I believe that that's the case? No. I believe that God will have mercy on them. They don't believe that God will have mercy on me. That's the difference.
Sure. And I think I would. Yeah. Well, let me just put it to you this way. In my priesthood, I have always followed a more stricter approach with myself. In its application with other people, I've been a little bit more, okay, here's the principles. And I rarely tell people, don't do X, Y, or Z. I tell them, here's the principles, you apply them. But in myself, I've always been a little bit stricter in that regard, only because I know myself. I'm kind of like you. I'm the type of guy that, you know, I tend to be a bit, my tendencies toward rebellion, I suppose, is just part of original sin, but that's just part of it. So that's one of the reasons I kind of hold myself to it. I think that this.
Okay, that is, I'm sorry, my dude, that is a humble brag. That is oh, I'm a rebel, but I keep myself in check, right? Because, I mean, yes, people I very strongly believe that people need rules and that people need structure. That is a fact. However, what he has dedicated his life to doing is picking and choosing which of the rules he wants to follow and which of the rules he doesn't. And that's fine. That's essentially what everybody does if they're a mature adult inside of a religious tradition. You make your own decisions. But again, he's just off in his own little corner of reality.
And actually, you brought up the one of the key notions, and that has to do with state of emergency. So, and I think I might even have asked you, but I can't remember. But I've texted a number of people who I consider knowledgeable about the history of the church and things of that sort, and even the canonical history. And I said, can anyone actually provide for me, either in a magisterial document or even in a noted saint/theologian, the actual definition of state of emergency?
And see, this whole actual definition thing is something that a lot of traditional Catholics are obsessed with. They want everything to be, this is the rule, you obey the rule, you figure out what the rule is, you follow the rule. And frankly, that is an overly rigid and overly legalistic approach. The Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, with canon law, tries to have, okay, this is the rule, but there can always be exceptions depending on circumstance. Nothing is black and white. Nothing is ever totally black and white. There's always room for the individual situation. They don't want that kind of a church. And frankly, again, I sometimes think that, these people would be, happier being Muslim. They would be happier being Jewish. They would be happier having firm yes or no rules on just about every aspect of their life. And I sometimes wonder if the only reason why some of these people are not Muslim or are not Jewish is because they've painted themselves, not because they would rather be, not because they want to be Catholic, but because they've painted themselves into a corner where they can't leave the Catholic Church. But they also don't want to move past the 1960s. They want everything frozen in 1940, 1930, 1910, 15 something. Again, the number always, the date always varies.
Virtually every single person I've ever talked to said, I have spent decades searching for that and have never found it. So the real problem is what you mean. I mean, I think that we would all agree. I mean, even the Vatican says that when we reach a state of emergency, that certain principles shift, because there's certain.
And again, the Vatican is referring to the Pope and the cardinals who advise him. Because part of this is that if the Pope says there is not a state of emergency, and you say, well, I think that there's a state of emergency, well, guess what? The SSPX doesn't get to overrule the Pope on this matter, right?
Principles that apply everywhere and in all cases, such as do good and avoid evil, applies everywhere in all cases. Yeah. But then St. Thomas says that there are certain principles that apply mediating the circumstances. And so obviously a state of emergency would cause the principles to shift. And so as a result of that, the principles would actually shift as to what the, which principles apply and how they apply. And in certain cases, how strictly they would actually apply.
Yeah, again, so it's putting the judgment of the SSPX, putting Chad Rippinger's interpretation of Aquinas over the people who, according to canon law, and frankly, according to 2,000 years of tradition, have the right to say, is there a state of emergency or is there not a state of emergency? But that simple answer of trust the Pope doesn't work when you disagree with the Pope. And again, at that point, you're either in or you're out. And frankly, that, okay, you have to listen to the Pope.
There is grave.
And frankly, that you have to listen to the Pope, you're in or you're out, was one of the things that caused a lot of people to leave the Catholic Church in the 1980s and 1990s, and basically the John Paul and Benedict era, over things like contraception, over things like same-sex marriage, over things like, not giving blessings to same-sex couples, not allow, just shutting the door on the possibility of women having a liturgical role. All of those were things that caused people to say, I can't obey the Pope, and leaving. And I would argue that that honest apostasy, because again, most of those people are starting to come back, or those people are starting to say, you know what, I really like Pope Leo. He's got some good things to say. Maybe, I'll go to mass like at Christmas or Easter. That's what they're talking about. So they are not willing to be honest apostates or honest schismatics, which, if they want to sit in the peanut gallery and and throw rocks, that's fine. But, maybe not the most honest. Okay, so let's see the next part.
have recourse to one's superiors. And so
Oh.
that's the best of definition.
Okay, let me rewind that just a little bit.
Physical access to one's
Okay,
the thing that I have no choice. I have to make a decision one way or another. And they'll just throw myself at the mercy of God. But that in case, but the most concise and best definition that I've heard to date is a state within the church in which there is not moral or physical access to one's superiors,
Right.
and yet there is grave pastoral cause or need to which normally one would have recourse to one's superiors. And so that's the best of definition that I've heard. So you'd have to have the state of circumstances that were so bad that you couldn't get access to one's superiors and that type of thing.
Okay, again, the SSPX have been addressed publicly by the Pope. The Pope has an email address. They have been given the opportunity to sit down with Cardinal Fernandez, who is the prefect for the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith. They are in regular contact with their superiors. When they're talking about no access, they're talking about the kind of situation that was faced by, say, John Paul II when he was the Archbishop of Krakow, and was sometimes not able to be did not have regular secure communication with the Vatican, and had to make decisions to, say, ordain some priests when it wasn't necessarily safe to do that. Or there were Catholics in Japan who, during the period where Japan decided to cut itself off from the rest of the world, who continued to practice their religion as best as they could with no priests, no nothing. That is what we're talking about when we mean state of emergency. It's not, I think the Pope's a meanie, and the Pope's saying things that I don't like, and the Pope's not giving me a pony and a bishop. And 4 bishops, 4 underqualified bishops. And keep in mind that Leo is the guy who had the job under Pope Francis of choosing bishops. So they could have very easily gone to him and said, appoint bishops for us. They could have even said, hey, here's the resumes of our guys. You choose the ones you want. They didn't ask for that because they want to create a walled garden that nothing can come in or out of until eventually the day when the Catholic Church just collapses into anarchy and they can walk back in with Pope Pius XIII. So they're hoping for Pius XIII's papacy. And I don't know that that day is going to come.
And so that's kind of the best definition. Now, how you're gonna, whether it needs, other parts need to be parsed out in relationship to it. There was actually someone suggested that, well, it could be modeled after the definition of state of emergency.
Okay, let's see.
You can live, and before that I was in the fraternity. You can live a traditional life without having to have recourse to where you can have ordinary jurisdiction, where you're not making a recourse to arguments that become a little bit could be dicey. In other words, you can actually live a fully traditional life without having to go down that route, generally speaking. However, I am willing to concede that there are certain parts in the world where there is situations where the ecclesiastical situation is so bad. So, for example.
Okay. I just wanted to play that short little clip. He's going to go into a very long story about how there are places in rural Montana where you have to drive 60 miles to get to a Catholic church. That's true. There are places in rural Montana where you have to drive 60, but that's because there are places in rural Montana where you have to drive 60 miles to get into town because it's a very scattered population. And that's actually something that has historically been a challenge for the Catholic Church in America, is that whereas in Europe, you would have a centralized village or a centralized town, and then you would have farmland around that town. Very often in America, you will end up with these sort of isolated farmsteads that are widely scattered. And when you're living in a rural community, just getting everybody together in the same location can be something of a challenge. But what Father Chad said was very interesting, because it's true. Right now, he is sitting content and sassy in the Archdiocese of Denver, Colorado, able to say the Mass in Latin. And again, I didn't have the opportunity to attend it for long story, but at the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Denver, Colorado, they offer a Latin Mass every single Sunday. So, yeah, so that kind of undercuts the SSPX argument. And again, you know, if people want to have horrible attitudes inside of their own heads, that's something that the church will try to educate them out of. But it's, as long as you keep your mouth shut, you can participate and have a normal, extremely theologically traditional, liturgically traditional, socially conservative, at least in regard to your own conduct, Catholic life without following the SSPX. And I think, and I know I keep belaboring this point, but I think that it's very important because it lets you see how hollow this argument is. Okay. So now I am going to skip ahead to 12 minutes in.
Tucho, the DDF prefect, who is idiosyncratic. None of us are huge fans, I'm sure. We don't need to talk about that, but he did do something that's
I am seriously tempted to start a Tucho Fernandez fan club. Just or at least if I ever make merch, it's going to be a I Heart Tuco. Because yeah, I mean, I disagree with him on certain points, but I think that he's leading the Catholic Church in a overall fairly healthy direction. And, you know, if we're going to have a referendum on Cardinal Fernandez, I am Team Tuco.
seemed good, and it was only my clips guy, my friend Jordan, who pointed this out to me or jogged my memory. He offered a specifically theological dialogue with them aimed to clarify their unresolved V2 questions and to clarify the minimum requirements for full communion by SSPX. And it was conditioned on pushing back the July 1st consecrations. But here's the thing, contrary to what they're saying the last 2 weeks, Superior General Pagliarani
responded back in February that this would be fruitless. We both know in advance that we can't agree doctrinally. And now Tuccio is saying, well, if you go ahead with it, it's going to be a schismatic act. The Pope has implied as much, but I hear all the SSPX adjacents. I'm sympathetic in many ways.
And just to be clear, what Timothy Gordon just said is a factual account of what went down. So, you know, that was the thing. He was like, okay, Cardinal Fernandez said, okay, let's sit down and talk. And the SSPX was like, no, because you're not going to agree to throw out all of Vatican II.
But I hear all their kind of big talkers out there saying they'll never enumerate the specifics. Tuccio, God bless him, he's not usually with us, but he actually offered to do this in February. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, I actually was. You know, as to what specific points that they would actually end up discussing, I think would be important. I think that, you know, going into that discussion, the first thing, if I were on the side of the SSPX, which, you know, in this discussion, the first thing I would do is establish with Tuco or Tuccio, or however you want to pronounce his name, I would establish, well, let's just first establish that Paul VI said that there was nothing extraordinary that happened at the council. Let's just establish that.
Yes, that's true. Paul VI was making it very clear that what Vatican II was doing was changing some things regarding to the liturgy. And also it was a council that was aimed at seeing, okay, this is what we believe. What is the best way to implement it? So a lot of the changes that came out of Vatican II were often doing things like reviving practices that had existed in the past. A very good example of that is communion in the hand. That was debated in the early church, but it was something that some people said yes, some people said no. So the church felt that there was room to, in some cases, go back to older practice. And that was what Paul VI meant. He did not mean that Vatican II was not binding, that Vatican II was not part of the magisterium. He was just saying that Vatican II was not going to propose any new doctrine. It was going to provide clarity, and it was going to provide a roadmap for what we were going to do, well, frankly, for the next 60 years. And I personally think that the Catholic Church is better and stronger for that decision.
So anything that is in the council that is not in congruity or could be demonstrated to be in congruity with the tradition is legitimately open to discussion, because I think that would at least open up the door to some degree. Yeah. And then you can talk about those things based upon the specific things based upon the merits of the thing. Because one of the biggest problems, as you know, is people just want to say, well, we just have to throw out all of Vatican II. Well, you can't do that, because there are certain things in there that are an expression of what the tradition has always held. The second is there's also points in which it was kind of the common opinion of theologians, but then it became enshrined in the council. So, for example,
and what Father Rippinger said there is actually true. That's accurate. And that's why, as of right now, he's willing to stand a little bit of the way in opposition to the Catholic Church, in opposition to the SSPX's decision to consecrate bishops, because he recognizes that Vatican II was not a complete rupture.
The how ordinary magisterial infallibility works, right? That type of thing. But anyway, that all being said, you can't just throw everything out. There has to be it literally has to go down to literally line by line in some of these cases. So you can't just throw it all out. So I think that that regardless of what happens on July 1st, I personally wouldn't mind seeing the Vatican being open to discussing these things in the light of the tradition. If they were,
It's worth noting that Pope Leo has been doing Sunday school catechesis, which you can find online if you care to check it out, where he is explaining some of the documents of Vatican II. He has also urged all Catholics to go and read some of the Vatican II documents. In obedience to that, I'm going to be going over some of the more recent papal encyclicals that have interesting information. But let us take this home. Let's see, 18.
Sounds like a Hollywood production. But I can't get over. I know people are going to get mad at me for saying this, okay, Father, but I just want you to say something on this. I cannot get over the fact that as much sympathy as I have for the SSPX position, all that, they'll do this Mott and Bailey where it's like, well, Vatican II is, technically it's sound, but it's bad through the spirit of Vatican II, which is kind of what everyone believes, even believing that spirit of Vatican II was cooked up before the council.
right.
More or less, I think that's probably your view and my view.
Okay, when they're talking about the spirit of Vatican II, they're basically talking about all of the people who enthusiastically embrace the reforms of Vatican II. And they're right. That was something that was going on in the Catholic Church prior to Vatican II, because guess what? Vatican II did not spring fully formed like Athena from the head of John the 23rd or Paul the 6th.
But then when they're really feeling their oats, even some places on the SSPX website, they'll say, but the council itself is bad. So it's that Mott and Bailey fallacy, the argumentative claim where you go back between a sexier, indefensible claim and a less sexy, much more defensible claim. But here's the thing on that one. Archbishop Lefebvre signed all constitution, decrees, and declaratios. That I can't get over. The lawyer in me,
yeah, that's true. Lefebvre signed the Vatican II documents and then started trying to undermine it, which, again, is the start of the pattern of the SSPX refusing to operate in good faith. And that's a problem.
Constitutional Convention scholar, because I've studied our Constitution and other constitutions pretty deeply, can't get over that. Don't sign it, so then you can stand on formality later. I'm always surprised when I refresh my own recollection that he signed them all. I just wanted you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I did hear that he signed it because he felt like he was trying to be obedient to the Pope because this is what the Pope wanted, etc. Which may be, and quite frankly, I'm pretty benign towards Lefebvre, and I'm with you. I'm pretty benign towards the SSPX. My experience of their
okay, and then let's see.
this. Like I said, I'm with you. I'm kind of rooting for him on one level, but on another level, I'm like, let's see how it all goes down. But the question I keep asking everybody is, well, if they consecrate the bishops without a papal mandate, which according to canon, which my understanding is according to canon law, and as I said, is an excommunicable offense, what is the Vatican doing about China?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay. The Vatican-China agreement, and I'm probably going to have to do a short video on that I can just refer people to. The Vatican-China agreement, we don't know everything that's in it. It was a very delicate, very carefully negotiated agreement between the Vatican and the government of China. And we know that one of the things that it includes is the fact that the Chinese government is allowed to nominate bishops. However, in order to be considered legitimate Catholic bishops, they have to be consecrated with a papal mandate. So right now, the Pope at least has veto power over Chinese bishops. This is a very bad time to be a religious or ethnic minority in China. Like, what is happening to the Uyghurs is, who are a ethnic Muslim minority, or an ethnic minority who are majority Muslim that live in China, is absolutely unspeakable. It is like literally, if I were to start telling you about some of the things that have been documented as having been done to Uyghurs, my channel would get pulled from YouTube, because YouTube does not tolerate describing those kinds of things. It's that bad. And in this particular case, the Pope was able to negotiate a slightly better situation. And part of the way they were able to do that was by giving the Chinese government a certain amount of say over the bishops, but maintaining the principle that if the Chinese government wants to present this as being in any sense a legitimate Catholic church, the Vatican has to have approval over the Vatican has to be the one issuing the mandate. The Pope has to approve those consecrations. So if the SSPX is allowed to just get away with it, which is what Rippinger is suggesting here, that is something that could put us back to the bad old days in China, where there was a schismatic, illegitimate Chinese church that was supported by the government. And then there was an underground Catholic church that was legitimately Catholic, in that their priests were legitimately ordained, that they had bishops that were consecrated with a papal mandate. That could all get blown up. So that's part of the reason why they're saying to the SSPX, no, we're not going to let you have these bishops unless you are willing to be obedient, because they know that the Chinese are watching it. I would also point out that in European history, there were a lot of big fights between kings and popes over who got to appoint bishops. And there are a lot of authoritarian governments all over the world who would love it if the president of their country was allowed to select the bishops. That's the world that we could be going into, and that's why the SSPX consecrations are going to incur automatic excommunication.
So if you're going to be consistent, you should be doing it with China too. Or you just don't do it with the SSPX. You just do what you do with China. You rubber stamp it later or whatever. But the point being is that there has to be a lack of hypocrisy, or at least the appearance of hypocrisy on that level.
Again, he is mischaracterizing what we know about the Vatican-China deal. And he is doing it in a way that could put the lives of Catholics living in China at risk.
Of course, absolutely. I mean, the CCP bishops are an understood sham, not just a technical sham, which these are. That's the weird thing about SSPX. They're the real deal. These guys are the realest, I won't say the term, the realest kids with a Z on the block when it comes to sacraments and sacramentals. But
it's not a day that favors men like them or yourself or myself. But
And yeah, they're right. I mean, again, the Catholic Church has a leftward boundary, the Catholic Church has a rightward boundary. Both of them get policed. It's that simple.
Yeah,
you know,
anytime I've ever dealt with the SSPX priests, and again, Bishop Flynn, there's a real desire to want to have everything above board with the Vatican and actually be obedient and all that type of thing. But I think in their mind, they're just like they're making it impossible for us because they're putting these situations. There's certain things that are in the way of that. But there it is.
Or rather, I would argue that they pay lip service to the idea of obedience while putting their own judgment over the judgment of the Pope.
well, okay, very last comment. It's always weird when people make that he just wanted to obey remark when you're invited to sign or not to sign. Like that's what a ratification convention is. It's like, hey, sign the dotted line. If you believe in it, you get a vote. Or if you don't sign, that's your vote against. Like you're encouraged by a curial institution to sign or not sign. So there were actual bishops who refused to sign the Vatican II, extreme minority, but that's straightforwardly not a matter of obedience. Whereas once we have, I'm not talking about the mafia, but once we
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So yeah, that's kind of where we are. The SSPX is going to be excommunicated as of July 1st. I may, just for funsies, live stream the consecration depending on when I would have to get up to do that. And yeah, that's where we are. So what's coming up on the channel for next week? Well, on Sunday we are going to have our normal our normal reading through the lectionary. On Tuesday, I'm going to be continuing to talk about Saint Joseph. I'm going to also be talking about some more recent saints who we also don't have a lot of biographical information about, and see, how those saints are presented. I'll be talking a little bit more about the Rosary, as part of the, project of understanding how Catholics actually relate to the Virgin Mary. And then on Thursday, Jordan of Reasons to Doubt will be joining me again in the second half of the show to talk about the Shroud of Turin. And in the first half, I will be going over a document from the Archdiocese of Chicago that takes a good hard look about who's converting to the Catholic Church in the last couple of years and why they're doing it. So it'll be a good time, and I look forward to seeing you. And okay, somebody dropped back in watching it from the beginning, I hope. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the live.